For the next 30 minutes, I want you to forget everything you think you know about American history. The comfortable narrative of continuous progress led by visionary leaders? That's about to be dismantled. Instead, I'll show you the actual mechanisms of change, the hidden gears and levers operated not by those in power, but by those who challenged it. By the end, you'll understand why this version of history was deliberately kept from you and what it means for our shared future. The invisible foundations, enslaved labor, and American wealth. When we learn about America's founding, we're told a story of visionary statesmen drafting declarations and debating constitutions. What's often missing from this narrative is a fundamental economic reality. America wasn't just founded on ideals, it was built on stolen labor. Behind the economic miracle of early America stood millions of enslaved people who created extraordinary wealth while receiving none of it themselves. The foundations of American prosperity weren't merely metaphorical, they were literal. The iconic white pillars of the nation's capital weren't just symbols of democracy. They were physically carved, transported, and erected by enslaved workers whose names history has largely forgotten. The White House and U.S. Capitol, buildings that symbolize American democracy worldwide, rose from the ground through the forced labor of enslaved people. These weren't peripheral contributors, but rather the primary workforce that constructed the physical embodiments of the new republic. The irony is staggering. The very buildings where laws were crafted to protect freedom were built by those who had none. This economic exploitation extended far beyond government buildings. By the mid-19th century, cotton had become the backbone of the American economy, accounting for more than half of all U.S. exports. This wasn't simply one industry among many, it was the engine driving America's industrial revolution and global trade dominance. Northern textile mills processed the cotton, international shipping companies transported it, and financial institutions invested in its production. The entire economic ecosystem of America pivoted around this crop harvested through brutal slave labor. What's particularly revealing is that enslaved people weren't just bodies forced to work. They were innovators whose knowledge and techniques dramatically increased American productivity. Agricultural practices like crop rotation were refined by enslaved workers who brought knowledge from Africa or developed new approaches under the harsh conditions of American plantations. When we discuss American innovation, we rarely acknowledge these critical contributions that transformed the nation's agricultural output. The commodification of human beings extended into the financial sector in ways that still shape our modern economy. Slave owners developed sophisticated financial instruments that treated people as collateral. Slave mortgages allowed plantation owners to borrow against the value of the people they enslaved. Insurance policies were written on human lives, not to protect those lives, but to protect the financial investment they represented to their owners. These financial innovations created capital that fueled expansion and development across sectors of the economy. Perhaps most disturbing is how thoroughly this economic foundation has been erased from conventional historical narratives. When American wealth creation is discussed in classrooms, the focus typically falls on entrepreneurial spirit, natural resources, and technological innovation. Rarely on the forced labor that made it all possible. This systematic erasure raises profound questions about which stories we choose to tell about our national origins and why. The scale of this economic theft is almost incomprehensible. According to recent economic analysis, the unpaid labor extracted from enslaved people would be valued at more than $14 trillion in today's dollars. This isn't merely a historical accounting exercise. It represents wealth that was never paid to those who created it, and instead accumulated in institutions and families that continue to hold disproportionate economic power today. Current wealth inequality in America cannot be understood without acknowledging this original economic injustice. This massive wealth transfer didn't just happen accidentally or as a sideline to American development. It was the central economic reality that made American prosperity possible. The cotton trade alone generated wealth equivalent to billions in today's dollars, creating capital that financed industrialization, westward expansion, and the rise of American financial institutions that still dominate global markets. Resistance in chains, slave rebellions, and freedom fighters. The economic profit generated through forced labor wasn't achieved through willing participation. Behind the sanitized textbook accounts lies an uncomfortable truth. Over 250 documented slave rebellions shook America's plantation system to its core, challenging the very foundation of the nation's economic engine. These weren't isolated incidents of desperation. They were calculated military operations led by brilliant strategists whose names deserve to be as familiar as those who drafted our founding documents. Consider the Stono Rebellion of 1739, one of America's earliest and most significant uprisings. Approximately 20 enslaved Africans gathered near the Stono River in South Carolina, seized weapons, and began a determined march southward toward Spanish Florida, where they believed freedom awaited. As they proceeded, their numbers swelled to nearly 100 participants who burned plantations and killed white owners who had profited from their captivity. This wasn't a spontaneous outbreak, but a strategically planned resistance with clear goals and leadership, traits that would characterize countless rebellions to follow. 6 decades later, a formerly enslaved blacksmith named Gabriel Prosser orchestrated what might have been the most ambitious slave rebellion in American history. In 1800, Prosser assembled thousands of enslaved people outside Richmond, Virginia, with a meticulously crafted military plan to capture the city, take the governor hostage, and negotiate for permanent freedom. The conspiracy extended across multiple counties with designated roles, weapons caches, and tactical objectives. Though ultimately betrayed by fellow enslaved people and thwarted by a severe thunderstorm, Gabriel's conspiracy demonstrated the sophisticated organizational capacity of resistance leaders. The aftermath brought swift and brutal repression. Prosser and many co-conspirators were executed, while fearful legislators enacted harsher slave codes throughout the South. Denmark Vesey's 1822 plot in Charleston represents another carefully orchestrated rebellion that never reached fruition. As a free black man who had purchased his own freedom after winning a lottery, Vesey spent years developing an elaborate network of conspirators across the region. His plan incorporated complex military strategy with coded communications and distinct command structures. When the plot was exposed, white authorities were shocked to discover the extent of organization, leading to Vesey's execution alongside dozens of suspected collaborators. Perhaps no rebellion strikes deeper in American memory than Nat Turner's 1831 uprising in Southampton County, Virginia. Turner, a deeply religious man who believed himself divinely appointed, led approximately 70 enslaved and free black people in an insurrection that resulted in the deaths of about 60 white individuals. Unlike previous rebellions that were discovered before implementation, Turner's revolt successfully executed its initial phase before being suppressed by militias and federal troops. The aftermath unleashed unprecedented terror across the South, with hundreds of black people, many uninvolved with the rebellion, murdered in retaliatory violence. State legislatures responded with increasingly draconian restrictions on both enslaved and free black communities. Beyond these documented large-scale rebellions, resistance manifested in countless daily acts of defiance. Maroon communities, established by escaped enslaved people in remote swamps and mountains, created independent societies that sometimes survived for generations. These autonomous enclaves engaged in guerrilla warfare against slave patrols and provided crucial safe havens for those fleeing captivity. Inside the plantation system itself, enslaved people developed sophisticated systems of resistance. Work slowdowns that reduced productivity, sabotage of equipment and crops, and the use of spirituals containing coded language to communicate escape plans and coordinate collective action. What's most remarkable is how effectively the historical record has been sanitized of this persistent resistance. Standard textbooks might mention Nat Turner in passing, but rarely emphasize how close these organized rebellions came to fundamentally destabilizing the entire economic system of the South. Slaveholders lived in perpetual fear of uprising, leading to increasingly brutal security measures that consumed massive resources. This constant state of tension and the economic costs of maintaining it directly accelerated the path toward abolition by exposing slavery's fundamental unsustainability, forging American identity, immigrant struggles, and contributions. Just as rebellions exposed the unsustainable nature of slavery, another American contradiction was taking shape through waves of immigration. While our national mythology celebrates America as a welcoming nation of immigrants, where the tired, poor, and huddled masses found refuge, the historical reality reveals a far more troubling pattern. Throughout our history, Each new immigrant group faced not open arms, but clenched fists. The Irish, who fled the potato famine in the 1840s, encountered a society determined to keep them marginalized. No Irish need apply signs weren't just occasional barriers. They represented systematic economic exclusion that forced many Irish immigrants into the most dangerous and undesirable jobs. Newspapers routinely portrayed the Irish with simian features, depicting them as drunken, violent, and intellectually inferior. This wasn't just cultural prejudice. It erupted into organized violence. Nativist riots targeted Irish neighborhoods and Catholic churches, with mobs burning buildings while families fled for their lives. Chinese immigrants who helped build the Transcontinental Railroad faced even more explicit exclusion. After providing the backbreaking labor that connected America from coast to coast, they were rewarded with the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the first and only federal law to ban immigration based specifically on nationality. This wasn't a minor footnote in immigration policy. It remained in effect for over 60 years, preventing Chinese laborers from entering the country and denying citizenship to those already here. The violence directed at Chinese communities reached horrific heights in incidents like the 1871 Los Angeles massacre. What began as a dispute in Chinatown escalated when a mob of approximately 500 white and Hispanic residents descended on the Chinese Quarter. While police stood by watching, the mob dragged Chinese residents from their homes, beating and hanging them in one of the largest mass lynchings in American history. When the violence finally ended, around 20 Chinese immigrants lay dead in the streets of Los Angeles, victims of a hatred so normalized that no one was ever successfully prosecuted for these murders. Mexican immigrants faced similar patterns of discrimination, particularly during the economic pressures of the Great Depression. Even those whose families had lived in territories that were once part of Mexico suddenly found themselves treated as unwelcome foreigners in lands their ancestors had inhabited for generations. What's particularly striking about America's history of anti-immigrant violence isn't just its brutality, but its selective amnesia. Each wave of established immigrants, having achieved a tentative acceptance, often participated in excluding the next group, forgetting their own community's struggle for recognition. Yet despite this sustained hostility, immigrant communities developed remarkable strategies of resistance and cultural preservation. Mutual aid societies emerged within each ethnic community, providing crucial support when American institutions offered none. These organizations pooled resources to help new arrivals find housing and employment, offered insurance benefits when mainstream companies wouldn't serve immigrants, and created safe spaces for cultural traditions to flourish. Cultural preservation became its own form of resistance. Despite aggressive Americanization programs designed to strip immigrants of their languages, food traditions, music, and cultural practices, communities established cultural organizations and festivals celebrating their heritage. They opened newspapers in their native languages, built community theaters, and maintained religious practices that connected them to their roots while adapting to their new homeland. Perhaps most significantly, immigrant communities transformed American labor movements. Irish, Italian, Jewish, and Chinese workers became pivotal forces in organizing for better working conditions, often facing accusations of radical foreign influence for simply demanding basic rights. These immigrant-led labor movements ultimately secured protections that benefited all American workers. What's most remarkable is how these communities, despite facing such hostility, fundamentally reshaped American identity itself. The contributions we now consider quintessentially American are often direct products of immigrant influence, from cuisine and music to language and political thought. Pizza, hamburgers, and hot dogs, all immigrant foods once considered foreign and suspicious, became American staples. Musical forms from Irish folk to Italian opera to Mexican mariachi blended into America's cultural landscape, creating entirely new American art forms. Labor's hidden war, the battle for workers' rights. Just as Americans are rarely taught about the constant resistance of enslaved people, there's another battlefield that's been scrubbed from our collective memory. The comfortable workplace protections we take for granted today, the 40-hour work week, minimum wage, safety regulations, weren't gifts bestowed by benevolent politicians. They were hard-won victories in a war where American workers literally gave their lives. When we learn about labor history in school, It's typically presented as a neat progression of enlightened legislation. The Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 established minimum wage and overtime pay. The Occupational Safety and Health Act of 1970 created workplace safety standards. These laws appear in textbooks as inevitable steps in America's march toward progress. But what's missing is the blood-soaked struggle that made them necessary. The true story begins with the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, a pivotal labor conflict that exposed the brutal lengths to which both corporations and the government would go to crush worker organizing. When railroad companies slashed wages by 10% during an economic downturn, workers across multiple states walked off the job. Their peaceful protest was met with astounding violence. Federal troops, deployed at the request of railroad companies, opened fire on American citizens demanding fair compensation for their labor. The resulting 52-day conflict saw over 100 workers killed by government forces. This wasn't a foreign invasion or an insurrection. This was the United States military firing upon its own citizens whose only crime was demanding livable wages after a pay cut. This shocking use of federal power to protect corporate interests rather than workers set a disturbing precedent that would continue for decades. 15 years later, at the Homestead Steel Works in Pennsylvania, another bloody chapter unfolded. When workers organized to protest wage cuts in 1892, the Carnegie Steel Company responded by hiring Pinkerton agents, essentially a private army of mercenaries, to crush the strike. The confrontation escalated into a pitched battle between workers and these corporate enforcers. Workers and their families, fighting for their economic survival, faced down armed men hired specifically to break their resistance through intimidation and violence. Perhaps most horrifying was the 1914 Ludlow Massacre in Colorado, where the stakes of this hidden war were laid bare in the most brutal fashion imaginable. Coal miners had gone on strike against the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company, owned by the Rockefeller family, to protest dangerous working conditions and exploitative practices. The striking workers and their families, evicted from company housing, established a tent colony nearby. On April 20th, 1914, the Colorado National Guard, ostensibly a force meant to protect citizens, attacked this colony of families with machine guns before setting fire to the tents. 20 people, including women and children, were killed. Some women and children suffocated while hiding in pits dug beneath the tents as they burned above them. This wasn't collateral damage. This was a deliberate massacre of American families whose only crime was demanding safer working conditions. Even in more recent memory, the violence continued. During the Memorial Day Massacre of 1937, police opened fire on a peaceful demonstration of striking steel workers in Chicago, killing 10 unarmed workers and injuring dozens more. These weren't isolated incidents, but part of a systematic campaign of violence against labor organizing that spanned generations. Why don't our history textbooks prominently feature these domestic battlefields? Why aren't the names of workers killed by corporate militias and government troops as familiar to us as soldiers who fell in foreign wars? The answer lies in who controls the narrative. The same corporate interests that once hired private armies to suppress labor have shaped how we understand this history through their influence on education, media, and politics. The workplace protections Americans now take for granted, the weekend, the 8-hour workday, overtime pay, workplace safety standards, child labor laws, weren't granted through the benevolence of legislators. They were concessions made only after decades of struggle and sacrifice by ordinary workers who faced bullets, batons, and brutality for demanding basic dignity. Each protection was written in the blood of those who came before us, fighting battles on American soil that have been carefully erased from our collective memory. The women's revolution, from Seneca Falls to Stonewall. Those workplace protections may have been written in blood, but they weren't the only rights Americans fought desperately to secure. When we think of women gaining the right to vote, our textbooks present a sanitized tale of reasonable women making persuasive arguments until enlightened men graciously extended the franchise. This comforting fiction erases one of the most militant political campaigns in American history. The suffragists who secured your mother's and grandmother's right to vote weren't just signing petitions. They were engaging in what would today be labeled domestic terrorism. These women didn't simply ask for the vote, they demanded it through relentless confrontation that saw them jailed, brutalized, and subjected to horrific treatment for daring to claim full citizenship. Consider the tactics of Alice Paul's National Woman's Party. These women staged the first-ever pickets of the White House, standing in silent protest through freezing winters and sweltering summers. When arrested on fabricated charges of obstructing traffic, they refused to pay fines and instead filled the jails. When they launched hunger strikes to protest their imprisonment, authorities responded with force feeding, a procedure where tubes were violently shoved down their throats or nostrils to pump their stomachs with raw eggs and milk, often causing bleeding, vomiting, and long-term physical trauma. This calculated militancy didn't emerge from nowhere. It built upon decades of organizing that began at the 1848 Seneca Falls Convention, where women like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott laid the foundation for female citizenship by demanding not just voting rights, but full social and economic equality. This radical vision, articulated 72 years before the 19th Amendment's passage, challenged the entire structure of American society in ways that remain revolutionary even today. What's particularly striking is how the historical record systematically minimizes the contributions of Black women who fought simultaneously against both gender and racial oppression. Figures like Ida B. Wells and Sojourner Truth confronted not just the patriarchal power structure, but also the racism within the suffrage movement itself. Wells, already legendary for her anti-lynching journalism, organized the Alpha Suffrage Club in Chicago, mobilizing Black women voters when partial suffrage was achieved in Illinois. Truth's powerful advocacy challenged white suffragists to recognize that their movement couldn't succeed without addressing racial injustice. This pattern of sanitizing women's activism extends to the women's liberation movement of the 1970s. What history books present as a series of legislative victories was actually a revolutionary campaign that fundamentally transformed American institutions. Women stormed male-only bars and restaurants, disrupted beauty pageants, occupied government offices, and established underground networks for reproductive health care when it was still illegal. They created their own media, built domestic violence shelters from scratch, and infiltrated male-dominated professions through both legal challenges and direct action. The women's liberation movement didn't just seek legal equality, it demanded a complete reimagining of gender roles across American society. These activists transformed workplaces, educational institutions, and family structures, challenging fundamental assumptions about who could do what jobs, who should raise children, and who deserved economic independence. The cultural shift they initiated continues to reshape American society today. Why does our conventional history so consistently soften these radical tactics and demands? Why are we taught that women were given rights rather than that they seized them through confrontational, often dangerous activism? The erasure serves a purpose. It obscures the reality that meaningful change rarely comes from polite requests to those in power. It comes from organized movements willing to make the status quo untenable. Original resistance, indigenous struggles for sovereignty, the same powers that sanitize women's militant struggle for equality have worked even harder to hide an uncomfortable reality. Native American resistance to colonization never ended. When your textbooks told you that indigenous struggle concluded at Wounded Knee in 1890, they perpetuated perhaps the most dangerous historical lie of all, one that erases not just past resistance, but ongoing movements that continue to successfully reclaim land, sovereignty, and cultural identity across America today. Most conventional histories present a neat narrative where indigenous resistance belonged only to the frontier era, ending definitively in the late 19th century. The story typically concludes with the massacre at Wounded Knee in 1890, presenting it as the final chapter in a doomed struggle against manifest destiny. The message is clear. Native Americans fought bravely, but inevitably lost, becoming relegated to history rather than active participants in America's ongoing story. This narrative conveniently ignores the continuous chain of resistance that stretches from early colonial encounters to the present day. Take Tecumseh's Confederacy in the early 1800s, a sophisticated political and military alliance that united tribes across vast territories. Tecumseh's pan-Indian movement wasn't just a desperate last stand, it was a forward-thinking diplomatic effort that nearly succeeded in halting westward expansion during the War of 1812. His vision of unified indigenous nations challenging colonial power structures wasn't extinguished with his death, but continued to inspire resistance movements for generations. Later in the 19th century, as the U.S. government declared the frontier closed, the ghost dance movement emerged as both spiritual revival and political resistance. Far from being merely a religious phenomenon, the ghost dance represented a profound challenge to American control over Western territories. It offered hope for cultural renewal and the restoration of traditional ways of life, including the return of the buffalo. The movement so threatened American authority that it prompted military intervention, culminating in the Wounded Knee Massacre. Not the end of Native resistance, but a tragic chapter in its ongoing story. The 20th century saw this resistance evolve rather than disappear. By the late 1960s, a new generation of indigenous activists emerged, armed with innovative tactics and a profound understanding of media and legal strategies. In November 1969, a group calling themselves Indians of All Tribes occupied Alcatraz Island in San Francisco Bay. Their 19-month occupation brilliantly turned American colonial logic on its head. They claimed the abandoned federal prison island by right of discovery, offering to purchase it for $24 in glass beads and cloth, mirroring the insulting transactions through which native lands had been acquired. Just 4 years later, the American Indian Movement, AIM, seized control of Wounded Knee, South Dakota, the same site as the 1890 massacre. For 71 days, they held the position against federal agents, drawing international attention to the U.S. government's failure to honor treaties and ongoing suppression of indigenous peoples. The occupation wasn't just symbolic. It forced Americans to confront the reality that the Indian problem hadn't been solved but merely ignored, with treaties violated and sovereignty denied. These actions set the stage for contemporary indigenous activism that continues to win remarkable victories. Recent years have seen unprecedented coalitions form to oppose pipeline projects threatening sacred lands and water sources. The Standing Rock Sioux's resistance to the Dakota Access Pipeline in 2016 drew supporters from over 300 tribes, the largest gathering of Native nations in more than a century, along with allies from around the world. What's more, indigenous nations have been winning significant legal battles affirming their sovereignty and land rights. In 2016, the U.S. Court of Appeals affirmed the Standing Rock Sioux tribe's right to challenge the Dakota Access Pipeline's construction, setting important precedents for tribal consultation. These victories aren't anomalies, but part of a sustained, strategic campaign to reclaim indigenous rights that colonial powers assumed had been permanently extinguished. Perhaps most powerfully, Native communities across the continent are successfully revitalizing languages once on the brink of extinction, reclaiming cultural traditions that government boarding schools tried to eradicate, and asserting governance systems that predate the United States itself. These efforts directly challenge the colonial assumption that indigenous cultures would inevitably vanish into the American melting pot. People power, how grassroots movements changed America. Beyond the resistance of indigenous peoples lies another untold chapter of American history, one where ordinary citizens have repeatedly transformed society against overwhelming opposition. Our official narratives tend to frame America's greatest advances as gifts bestowed by forward-thinking politicians signing landmark legislation. But look closer, and an uncomfortable pattern emerges. Virtually every significant reform in American history has been forced through by grassroots movements that the political establishment initially condemned as radical, dangerous, or un-American. Consider the Montgomery bus boycott, a masterclass in strategic grassroots organizing that fundamentally altered the nation's trajectory. For 381 consecutive days, 40,000 African Americans refused to ride segregated buses, creating an economic crisis that the city's leadership couldn't ignore. This wasn't a brief symbolic gesture. It was sustained collective action requiring immense sacrifice and coordination. Participants walked miles to work daily, organized intricate carpooling networks, and withstood threats of violence and job termination. Their persistence ultimately forced a federal court ruling that declared segregated seating unconstitutional. This pattern repeats throughout American history. The environmental protections we now take for granted didn't originate from enlightened politicians suddenly concerned about pollution. They emerged from local communities fighting industrial contamination of their air and water. Regular citizens documented health impacts, organized their neighbors, and confronted powerful corporate interests. This grassroots pressure ultimately led to the establishment of the Environmental Protection Agency in 1970, not because politicians spontaneously prioritized environmental concerns, but because a groundswell of public activism made inaction politically untenable. The transformation in LGBTQ+ rights followed a similar trajectory. Before marriage equality became mainstream, there were the patrons of the Stonewall Inn who, in 1969, finally fought back against routine police harassment. This watershed moment of resistance wasn't planned by political strategists or approved by focus groups. It was a spontaneous uprising against persistent injustice. That single act of defiance catalyzed a movement that would gradually transform American attitudes and laws regarding sexual orientation and gender identity. The long journey from criminalization to constitutional protection for same-sex marriage wasn't guided by politicians. They were dragged along by decades of courageous activism. Perhaps most striking is how disability rights activists literally put their bodies on the line to secure basic access and protections. Unable to navigate a world built without consideration for their needs, activists with disabilities engaged in direct action that could not be ignored. They chained themselves to buildings, blocked inaccessible buses, and occupied government offices. Physical demonstrations of how architectural barriers excluded them from public life. These bold tactics led to the 1973 Rehabilitation Act, prohibiting discrimination based on disability in federally funded programs. Yet this victory came only after sustained pressure from grassroots activists who refused to accept exclusion as inevitable. What's most revealing is how consistently these movements faced initial opposition from the very political establishment that would later claim credit for the changes. During the civil rights movement, many politicians actively resisted desegregation efforts, using state power to arrest activists and sometimes allowing violent suppression of peaceful protests. The same pattern has repeated with virtually every major social advance: initial condemnation followed by reluctant acceptance, and eventually historical revision that minimizes the confrontational nature of the original movement. This pattern continues today. The Women's March in 2017 mobilized millions across the globe, demonstrating how collective action remains a powerful force for change. Similarly, the Black Lives Matter movement has pushed issues of systemic racism and police violence onto the national agenda through persistent grassroots organizing, despite significant institutional resistance. Throughout our journey today, we've unveiled a profound truth about American progress, one that historian Howard Zinn captured perfectly when he said, "The history of the United States is the history of the people who have fought for their rights." This statement isn't merely theoretical. It's evidenced by recent data showing 70% of Americans participated in some form of activism in 2020 alone. The Black Lives Matter movement exemplifies this continuing tradition, demonstrating how grassroots organizing still shapes our national discourse on fundamental issues like racial justice. This pattern of change from below reveals America's authentic character, not as a finished product bestowed by founders, but as an ongoing project built by ordinary citizens demanding that reality match our ideals. By understanding this people's history, we gain more than just historical accuracy. We inherit a proven blueprint for addressing today's challenges through collective action. Perhaps the most patriotic act isn't uncritical celebration of a sanitized past, but rather joining this long American tradition of ordinary people organizing to bend the moral arc of our nation toward justice. Like, comment, and subscribe to my channel for more untold histories.